Secretary Yellen gave a speech. And I admit, I didn't stay up late to watch. But a lot of people did. Because when I woke up in the morning, in my WeChat, I had messages, including from some of you in the audience, about what did this speech mean? And I can tell you, Madam Secretary, that your speech, more than almost to watch. But a lot of people did. Because when I woke up in the morning, in my WeChat, I had messages, including from some of you in the audience, about what did this speech mean? And I can tell you, Madam Secretary, that your speech, more than almost anything else, captured the attention of Chinese policymakers and the Chinese public to say, you know what? Maybe the US policy is not about containment. Maybe it really is, how can we work together and share the space? So your speech really helped drive the door open. So it's really an honor for us as a business community who recognize the value of a relationship with China and fair economic competition to have you come back. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming very warmly Secretary Yellen.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to the American Chamber of Commerce for hosting this event. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to speak to American businesses here in Guangzhou at the start of my visit. This city holds a unique position in Chinese economic history. It was key to Chinese trade for centuries, and in fact, to the start of the US-China trade, with the first ship from the newly independent United States docking at Guangzhou in 1784. Then Guangzhou was at the heart of the market-oriented reforms and industrial development that drove China's tremendous growth. And it was a key stop on Deng Xiaoping's 1992 Southern tour, when he renewed China's commitment to these reforms. Today, as all of you know well, Guangzhou remains the top destination for foreign investment in China, including from Fortune Global 500 companies. It's a fitting place for me to emphasize the strong economic ties between the United States and China and the benefits that these ties can bring for both the US and Chinese economies. I'd also like to touch on concerns that I've heard from American businesses, which I intend to discuss with my Chinese counterparts this week. Well, let me start with the importance of the US-China economic relationship. 1 year ago, I laid out our administration's approach to China, outlining 3 key objectives. The United States will pursue a healthy economic relationship with China. We will seek to cooperate with China on global challenges, and we will deploy our economic tools when needed and in a narrowly targeted manner to protect our national security and that of our allies, as well as human rights. President Biden and I firmly reject the idea that the United States should decouple from China. A full economic separation is neither practical nor desirable, as both the US and China have affirmed in public statements following our high-level bilateral meetings. Indeed, America's economic strategy is centered around investing in our economic strength. Over the past 3 years, our administration's policies have helped drive an historic economic recovery and laid the foundation for long-term economic growth. We're also deepening our ties with allies and partners around the world while continuing to pursue the broad swath of economic activities between the US and China that can benefit both countries. Our conviction in the importance of a healthy economic relationship is rooted in an understanding of the roles that the United States and China play in the global economy. Together, the US and China represent 40% of global GDP. We have the world's largest financial systems. Countries around the world watch both of our economies, but also our interactions, as they're crucial to global growth. The U.S. is China's largest trading partner, and China is the United States' third largest trading partner following Canada and Mexico. With a large and growing middle class, China represents a huge market for American manufacturers and other firms, including those represented in this room. Exports to China, from transportation equipment to integrated circuits, support over 700,000 American jobs, and Chinese companies employ additional American workers. Put simply, the U.S.-China bilateral economic relationship is among the most important in the world. Responsibly managing it is essential. At President Biden's direction, we've taken steps over the last 2 years that have put the U.S.-China economic relationship on much surer footing. One of my key priorities has been to establish resilient communication channels between the U.S. and China, which I've done through engagements with my counterparts at home and in China. We launched and hold regular meetings of the economic and financial working groups, bringing together policy teams from both our countries to discuss key aspects of our relationship, from monitoring economic and financial risks to identifying and pursuing areas of potential cooperation. For areas where we disagree, communication helps prevent misunderstanding from leading to unintended escalation and allows us to frankly convey concerns. It's in this spirit of continuing to move the U.S.-China relationship in a constructive direction that I'd like to share my concerns about the business environment in China and the ability of American firms to compete on a level playing field. I've heard from many American business executives that operating in China can be challenging. I understand that the Chamber's recent survey found that 1/3 of American firms in China report experiencing unfair treatment compared to local competitors. We've seen the PRC pursue unfair economic practices, including imposing barriers to access for foreign firms and taking coercive actions against American companies. I strongly believe that this doesn't only hurt these American firms. Ending these unfair practices would benefit China by improving the business climate here, and I intend to raise these issues in meetings this week. I know that American businesses are also concerned about the impacts of China's shift away from a market approach on the U.S. and global economy. I'm especially concerned about overcapacity, which members of the Chamber identified as a concern in the Chamber's recent survey as well. Overcapacity isn't a new problem, but it is intensified, and we're seeing emerging risks in new sectors. Specifically, direct and indirect government support is currently leading to production capacity that significantly exceeds China's domestic demand, as well as what the global market can bear. I understand these policies may be driven by domestic development objectives, but overcapacity can lead to large volumes of exports at depressed prices. This can undercut the business of American firms and workers, as well as of firms around the world, including in India and Mexico. And it can lead to overconcentration of supply chains, posing a risk to global economic resilience. This will be a key topic of discussion with counterparts in the coming days. Overcapacity also poses challenges for Chinese firms and industries, and can impact China's productivity and growth. I believe addressing overcapacity and, more generally, considering market-based reforms is in China's interest. As I've said before, China is too large to export its way to rapid growth. And if policies are oriented only at generating supply and not also at generating demand, global spillovers will result. China's implementation of market reforms generated one of the most significant economic success stories of our lifetimes, lifting hundreds of millions of people from poverty. There's potential for significant gains from reform now as well. Well, I see today's event as an opportunity to deepen my understanding of what's needed by hearing from you, American businesses, about the successes you've had and the challenges you face. Throughout this week, I intend to communicate our commitment to a healthy U.S.-China economic relationship. I'll also raise concerns as part of further stabilizing the relationship and in order to realize greater benefits for the United States, for China, and for the global economy. The Biden administration's efforts over the past year to build a resilient foundation for the U.S.-China economic relationship have made the constructive exchanges I hope to have possible. As I said when I spoke at the U.S.-China Business Council in December, I'm convinced that the course we're charting is not just pragmatic. It will lead to building a healthy economic relationship that benefits American firms and workers. And it's what's required of the world's two largest economies if we hope to achieve the best outcomes for our people and for people around the world. So I want to thank you for being here today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary. On behalf of the American business community, thank you for coming to Guangzhou and making the trip to China. I've got sort of three questions for you here, and as you've just spoken, I may have reiterated some of them, but I'll let you put a finer point on it. But as the ambassador said, you've made two trips. So following your trip last year, the U.S. and China have resumed more intense communications. How do you see the outlook and the trajectory of the U.S.-China economic relationship at the moment, and what do you hope to get out of this trip? But I know you outlined some of that, but I'll let you underline some of that.
Well, thanks so much for that question. I think it's important to start out with really the obvious. The U.S. and China, two largest economies in the world, we're deeply integrated with one another. Overall trade between our countries is now in the high hundreds of billions of dollars. As I mentioned, we trade more with China than with any countries other than Canada and Mexico. American firms have extensive operations here. Hundreds of Chinese firms are listed on our stock exchange. As we take actions to diversify our supply chains and protect our national security, we also understand the value of our overall trade and investment relationship with China. And there is just a broad swath of economic interactions that are and should remain completely uncontroversial to both sides. So the President and I really reject the idea that we should decouple our economy from China's. Rather, we're seeking a healthy economic relationship, but importantly on a level playing field that can benefit both sides. I think that President Biden's approach to the U.S.-China economic relationship is one that's grounded in reality. Over the past 2 years, we have resumed high-level communications with the Chinese, and we've worked with them to address our concerns about Chinese practices that are tilting the playing field away from American workers and firms. So I think it's critical, whether it's in the economic or the national security realms, that both sides communicate directly, openly, and honestly, and it's especially important when we disagree. And really, that's what's been happening over the past year, and that's what's brought me for my second trip to China. So during this trip, my intention and hope is that I'll make progress on goals that I laid out for the U.S.-China economic relationship this year. First, to continue to manage the U.S.-China bilateral economic relationship so that it is a resilient one, a relationship that can withstand shocks and challenging circumstances. And second, to press for clarity on China's economic policies and raise concerns like those I mentioned on areas where we disagree, including overcapacity. And finally, I hope to accelerate our work with China on areas where our countries and many countries around the globe would benefit from our collaboration and our joint leadership. An example would be our joint efforts to combat illicit finance. So these are three goals, and I hope to make progress on them during this trip.
Great, thank you for that. And can I dig in just a little bit more on that in terms of the areas for cooperation? So what are some areas, in addition to the one you just mentioned, that the U.S. and China can cooperate, and how open do you think they are, that China is, to that cooperation?
Well, so let me say, I want to emphasize, I think it's critical that the world's two largest economies do communicate and cooperate on major economic, financial, and environmental issues facing the globe. And we need to do so even if we have various bilateral differences. It's in our own interests, and it's what the world expects and requires of us. So there are several areas where I believe we can and already have made progress. First, it's important our two countries can and are closely cooperating on economic and financial issues that have global repercussions. Economic developments in our respective countries can quickly cascade around the world. Since I visited Beijing last year, the United States and China has, as I mentioned, established two working groups, an economic working group, financial working group, and these groups have provided an ongoing structured channel for frank and substantive discussions. We've held technical exchanges between our sides, including an exercise on how we would jointly deal with the failure of a large bank in the US or in China. We've also begun working more closely together on anti-money laundering and combating illicit finance. And I think this is something that's particularly important because criminals are able to exploit gaps in the financial regulatory regime in either of our countries to finance illicit activities. And our work on illicit finance is something that I expect to discuss with Vice Premier He when I meet him later today, and it's one where I'm hoping we can, during this trip, make some further progress. Second, both countries absolutely have to cooperate to address what is the world's, I think, to me, toughest global challenge, and that's on climate change, which is truly existential. Bilateral cooperation between our two countries is really what enabled the breakthrough of the Paris Agreement, and we now have an obligation to continue building on the work we have done that's related to climate finance. Treasury and the People's Bank of China have, for several years now, been successfully co-chairing the G20 Sustainable Finance Working Group, and I think there's scope for greater collaboration on climate finance. Some topics for our joint work range from transition finance to voluntary carbon markets to biodiversity and nature. And finally, I would mention sovereign debt issues, which many countries around the world unfortunately are dealing with as an area that we've been working on now for over a year with China and will continue to work jointly to try to address.
Okay, thank you. Something you mentioned earlier, concerns about overcapacity in Chinese industries. What have you heard from our foreign counterparts on this issue, and any idea yet how the Chinese see this issue?
Well, I will say that excess capacity is a concern in the United States. It's one I intend to raise while I'm here, but it is a concern that many countries share. That's what we're hearing, and it's one we would like to address with the PRC in a constructive manner. Concerns about overcapacity from a range of advanced and developing countries, not something that's new. In October of 2023, the EU launched an investigation into subsidies for Chinese EV exports to Europe. In industries like steel, countries like Mexico were forced to put up tariffs to try to contend with spillovers from Chinese overcapacity. I've heard from several foreign counterparts who are concerned that overcapacity is now really growing as a threat, and they share lessons we learned from past episodes where there was Chinese overcapacity, and they're really quite determined to make sure that their industries, particularly EVs, batteries, solar, do not go out of business because of artificially cheap exports from China. And I guess I'd like to underscore that our concern with overcapacity, this is not anti-China policy. It's an effort for us to mitigate the risks from the inevitable global economic dislocation that will result if China doesn't adjust its policies. And it is in the spirit of moving the U.S.-China economic relationship toward, in a kind of constructive direction. That's the spirit in which I will be raising these concerns with Vice Premier He and other Chinese counterparts this week. Now, I don't want to speak for the Chinese for their views on overcapacity, but I can say that China's own Central Economic Work Conference acknowledged overcapacity in some industries as a concerning feature of the Chinese economy just this last December. As an economist, I really think that a shift in policy would actually be beneficial for China. It would avoid the resource misallocation that occurs when government subsidies are channeled to firms that wouldn't otherwise be viable. And that's something that would improve China's productivity. And I suppose more broadly, I believe that a structural macroeconomic shift that lifts domestic household consumption would be something that's in China's interest, and it would be something that's good for the global economy.
Great, thank you for that. I believe this concludes the public questions. If everybody can stay seated.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated as we allow the press to exit the room. We'll continue shortly.